we'll wait a couple minutes, probably 9:03, 9:04, give everyone a chance to settle in, get started, and so that no one misses any content. But yeah, thanks for joining. Also, if you're new to Turbo, you're gonna need to install a couple things. So if you don't already have this installed, hey Daniel, thanks for joining us from Chile. Hopefully it's cooler where you are than where I am. It's really hot here in New York City. It's like 100 degrees every day, so hopefully you're a little bit more comfortable than I am. So make sure you have the Turbo CLI installed. Right now, the current version of the Turbo CLI is 2.2.39. If you do not have it, here's what you need to do. You do sudo npm i-g turbo CLI. And just make sure that's set to go on your end. Obviously, we want to use that, as well as a Turbo account to deploy our project. So we're going to deploy the project on the Turbo architecture. So if you do not have a Turbo account, go ahead and sign up right now. It is free, so you can just create an account right now in 2 seconds and then come right back. So go ahead here to turbo360.co and just scroll all the way to the bottom and click on the free option to create an account. And once you have that, we will be set to go with deploying your projects. Also, you will need Mongo, a local instance of Mongo running. We may not need that today. This is certainly going to go through at least 2 sessions, maybe 3. So if we don't get to it today, that's fine. Make sure you have it for tomorrow then as well. Oh, hey Mona, how are you? I didn't know you were in New York. I thought you were in California for some reason. So make sure you have Mongo installed on your machine. Again, I'm not sure if we're going to get to it today, but if we do, great. If not, we'll do it tomorrow. So make sure you have it installed for tomorrow. So I anticipate this series to take about 2 or 3 videos at the most. So going into tomorrow and Wednesday, it's going to be the same time every day, so 9 p.m. Eastern. So if you want to follow up tomorrow or the next day, 9 p.m. Eastern. Obviously, this is going to be on my website and my YouTube channel as well, so you can always watch it after the fact. But if you join live like you are right now, then you can ask questions and I can answer them. I can answer your questions during the actual video, rather than maybe getting back to you on Slack or something like that. So oftentimes what happens is people struggle with something on the videos well after I record them. I might have recorded a video like 1.5 years ago, and I'll get an email saying, "Hey, this doesn't work. Can you show me how to do it?" And a lot of times it's not very practical. But if you're on the live chat right now, oh, thanks. Yeah, hopefully you're able to follow the videos. If you're on the live chat right now, that means obviously you can post questions, and then I can answer them during the chat. So that'll make it easier to make this whole process a little bit more interactive. So cool. All right. So oops, let me cancel that. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to CD to my desktop to create this project. Obviously, you can do it wherever you want to, but I'm going to do this on the desktop. What we're going to do is create a very, very simple React Redux application where Caesar, Docker is going to be too overkill for this. If you can just run a local Mongo instance on your machine, you should be fine. I mean, there's no reason why you couldn't use Docker, but if you have any sort of problems that I might not be able to quickly figure out. So going back to what I was saying, we're going to create a very simple React Redux application. Very, very simple, very primitive. This is meant for a beginner for React and Redux, not for a total beginner as a programmer, though. You should know basic JavaScript and JavaScript syntax and classes and stuff like that. Yeah, and we're going to have a login form and a registration form, and we're going to register a user and then have the user be able to log in and log out, and then run all that through the Redux flow. And that's pretty much it. So like I was saying, this is meant for React Redux beginners, but not so much beginner programmers. If you're a total beginner as a programmer, you might struggle keeping up. But Okay, so that's it. Let's get started. So I'm going to create a new project on my desktop right now. Call it user auth. And we're going to use the React flag on the Turbo scaffold. So if you've been following Turbo for a while, you know that the React flag gives you a full React Redux environment right out of the box. So it's pretty convenient just to get that going. So once you have that scaffolded, cd into the project directory and run the npm install so we install all the necessary dependencies. So while that's going, I'm going to open up the project. Actually, let me pop this out. I'm going to open up the project right now on using Sublime. So we can quickly step through the architecture while the npm is doing its installs. So here is the code base that's scaffolded for you by the Turbo scaffold. So if you look at the views, the index mustache is the entry point. Not much to see here other than this is where the React entry is going to take place. All the action happens here in the src directory, where we see the full React Redux architecture scaffolded out of the box. There's a lot of template code here as well, which we're just going to get rid of, so don't worry about it. But if you look at the index.js file, this is where the actual entry code takes place. And this intro component is the first one that actually renders out of the scaffold. We will remove that right away. But before we do, let's go ahead and make sure everything worked. So the install should be just about finishing up right now. And once this is done, we're going to run the dev server and make sure everything looks accurate right out of the scaffold. So let's go ahead and run the dev server when this is done in a few seconds. Great. So to run the dev server, Turbo dev server, pretty simple. And it runs it on localhost 3000. So just wait for that to show up. Head over to localhost 3000. And we should see this. That means it worked. And this is a React Redux project. If you have the React plugin, you'll see that this indicator right here indicates that it's running a React production build, which it is. So if you actually look at the source code, you will see the same thing. You'll see the entry point and the imports and whatnot, some basic Bootstrap CSS import. And that's pretty much it. So that worked successfully. Let's make sure it works on staging as well, just to make sure the entire environment is properly configured. So I'm going to head over to my Turbo account. Head over to your dashboard, your account dashboard, and let's create a new project. I'm going to call this one user auth demo, like that. Click create application so that we create the staging environment on our account. We want to grab the app ID, so just copy that guy. And then head over to your shell, your terminal, and inside the project root directory, we do turbo app, and then we paste in our app ID, like so. And this connects your local project source to your staging environment on the Turbo platform, which, by the way, is just an AWS abstraction. So one of the new features I built into Turbo in the last month or so is that you can deploy your Turbo projects on your own AWS account now. And I'll show you how to do that in a future tutorial. But that removes all vendor lock-in concerns, which has been an issue raised by a couple of developers I've worked with, that they want to be able to deploy this on their own environment. So now you can do that by linking your Turbo CLI to your own AWS environment. So, hey Casey, how are you? So you can now do that on Turbo, and I'll show you how to do that in a future tutorial, probably in the next week or so. So now that we have our local source connected to our remote staging environment, we do turbo deploy, and it's going to send it up to the staging environment on the Turbo platform, which again is just an AWS abstraction. So right now, what's happening underneath the hood is it's creating what's called a Lambda function, which is going to run your application, and then deploying the source files for that function to the Lambda function. And then that Lambda function is integrated through what's called an API gateway. And Turbo is essentially the API gateway. That's essentially what it is. So it routes all requests to Lambda functions. And that's essentially what Turbo is. It routes incoming HTTP requests to various Lambda functions, which runs your website. And that's currently taking place right now. So this right here, this is the uploading of the source files to your Lambda function. And basically all you're doing here is creating an AWS Lambda function, which is invoked through the gateway, which sits behind what's called a load balancer, which is where Turbo basically interfaces with the load balancer. So now this is done. So let's go ahead and test that. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that, Casey. Well, hopefully your things are better on your end. The weather here in New York City is really hot, so hopefully you're not experiencing that, at least, or maybe you are. I don't know, but all right. So now this is the staging environment, which is running the same thing. So that means the deployment worked. And again, if you're curious about the intricacies going on, we're just running Lambda functions through the Turbo ecosystem, and that's essentially, at its core, that's what Turbo is. So that's what I spent the last year building. So, all right, cool. So everything worked on both ends of the environment. So now we're ready to develop and start building out the project and start creating our application. Let's go ahead and get going on that. Obviously, if you have any problems, if something's not working on your end, or if you have any questions, please interject in the chat room. That's pretty much the main value of these live feeds. And whatever questions you may or may not have, rest assured somebody else probably already has that same question. So, but make sure everything's working on your end as well. And let's go ahead and get started. So let's run the dev server again. Can you use Turbo for production? Yes, you can. I have a handful of websites running through production on Turbo. I didn't document exactly how to do that right away because, well, mostly because I'm really busy, and I tried to hire someone to do that and it didn't work out. So, but the answer is yes. Yes, you can. This is a project I'm working on right now that's running through Turbo. So it's a sports gambling website, and if you look at here, you'll see that the Turbo URL, it's not the Turbo URL, it's an actual URL domain, a custom domain name that I route through the Turbo system. You can do that on your own deployment as well. So I was explaining earlier, Caesar, excuse me, that you can deploy Turbo on your own in AWS environment, and that doesn't preclude you from running Turbo through a custom domain. In fact, it's a little bit easier even. So I'll start doing some videos on how to do that. So here I'm running localhost. First thing we want to do is get rid of all this content and replace it with our own. Let's go ahead and do that. So inside of our index file right here in the src directory, this intro component is what we're looking at right now, is all of this right here. So let's get rid of that guy. And let's replace it with our own stuff. Welcome to my project. And let's go back here and run the npm build, npm run build. And the provider, if you're new to React, the provider is the component that glues your project to the React architecture. So we need this provider. Basically, it attaches your project to the Redux architecture. And again, the Redux flow is already set up here. So we will be going through that in a few moments. But right now, we just want to confirm that this whole thing is working again. And so now I'm running the dev server. And here we go, right there. So we're set to go. We now have control of the UI. So let's go ahead and get started and start building out some of our own components and start building out some functionality. So I'm going to turn off the server. And the first thing we're going to do is create a component inside the containers directory. And I'm going to call it auth. So let's go ahead and cd to the src components and then the containers directory. So right now I'm inside this directory, and then I'm going to create a new component called auth component, and that will handle the registration and the user login functionality. So let's, oh, I also cd back to the root directory. It's just a good habit to get into. So inside the index directory of the containers, we want to get rid of this users one. This is just some pre-scaffolded code that isn't really, we're not going to use it. But instead, we want to export the auth component. And inside the auth component, we need to start writing our React code. So here, we're starting from scratch. I'm going to write everything here from scratch at least. And we're going to create a very basic component and make sure that that guy renders properly. Okay, so here I'm just going to create a very, very simple div. And that div is going to say, this is the auth component. Okay, so now we have obviously a very, very simple container component. It's being exported here, hopefully properly. So now if we go back to the index file, we want to import that guy. So that's going to be auth from components, containers, like that. Okay, so here we are now importing the auth component into the main entry point, and now we can render that instead of this welcome text, and hopefully that should work. So let's test it out. So let's run npm run build. Oh, what did I forget here? So right here, I forgot to close the tag. So I just opened another div tag by mistake. So let's try it again. Alrighty, clean build. So let's run the dev server and make sure that that component renders. Let's see here. All right, this is the auth component. Great. So now we are rendering the auth component right here. And we're pretty much done with the index for now. Well, pretty much for the entirety of this project, we're done with the index. We can get rid of that now. So now we're going to do all of our work in here. So let's go ahead and set up this from a UI standpoint. So first thing I want to do is create some padding here. I'm going to use a container class, a container bootstrap class for that. So you may remember that in JSX, we have to use class name to specify classes. And then what we want to show here is a registration form as well as a login form. So those are going to be two forms, which are going to be pretty much the same, just username and password. But we want to just demonstrate two different pieces of functionality. So we're going to set up both forms. So let's create a very simple header tag. And let's call this one register. And then let's create another one down here for login. And then inside each one of these, let's set up a form with two inputs. They're going to be type text, and the placeholder here will be username. And then I'm going to throw in a line break. And then let's do password here. And this has to be a password type input. Okay, and then here we're going to add a button saying join. All right. And while we're at it, let's go ahead and just do a quick one for login. And we do have Bootstrap already implemented in this. Remember, in the index.js, you'll see, well, inside the head partial at least, you'll see that we have Bootstrap already implemented. So we can use bootstrap classes. So let's use form control. Alrighty, and since we're using bootstrap classes, let's use a row here. So I want to do a row, and then inside that row, we're going to do a column 6. So it only takes up half the screen. So let's throw all these guys inside that column 6 row, or column 6 column, not a row, excuse me. And that should be good for now. Right, let's see how that looks. So let's go ahead and run the build. And then let's run the dev server, and let's make sure that that looks the way we expect it to. So register, login, very good. And I'm going to add a little bit of a couple more pieces of functionality, or UI, excuse me. I'm going to head over to the index.js, index mustache, sorry. I'm going to create a background color here, just to make it easier to see. And then let's see here. I'm going to add a line break. So just to make things a little bit easier to distinguish on the actual UI. Now you may notice that running the build every single time we make changes can be a little bit cumbersome. So what we're going to do is we're going to open a new tab in the terminal, so Command T. And the scaffold comes with a development build script out of the box. So we can do npm run dev like that. And that's going to run Webpack with the watch flag. So now we can just leave this guy running in a separate window, in a separate tab, excuse me. And we don't have to keep on rebuilding the project now. So that'll make it a little easier. That'll make our workflow a little bit better, I assume. So we're good to go on that. So, and also notice how here this becomes orange. That's because now we're running the development builds. So the orange color means development build, and the black and blue means production build. So now we're running the dev build, so we don't have to worry about running the build script over and over again. So great. Okay, so this is a container component. This is going to be connected to the Redux store. We're not using Redux yet. So far, this is pure React. So we're going to set up some state here. And we will use the state to track the values inputted into the register and login forms. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm not using hot module reload. I just prefer the Webpack watch, which is fine. So here I'm going to set up a visitor object, which will have a username and a password key. Okay. And then as the user types into these fields, this visitor property in the state will be updated as the user types. Let me wrap the word right there. I don't know if that's easier to see. There we go. Okay, so let's do on change. This update visitor, find this. So you may have noticed we're calling a function here that doesn't exist. So that's not going to work. So we have to create that function. That's going to take an event key. And then let's go ahead and do a console log. Update visitor. And then let's go ahead and add that on change listener to all the inputs. Okay. And this time we got to open the console. So Option Command I if you're using a Mac. And if we reload, you can see that this is now happening. And notice I did not rerun the build, because the watcher has taken care of that for us. So that's good. Okay, great. So the on-change listener has been connected. I'm going to add an argument to each one of these calls. So this is going to be username. But what I'm doing here is I'm passing in, this should be password. I'm passing in an argument to these function calls, so that inside this actual function, I can distinguish which attribute is actually being typed into. So rather than just update visitor, I can see literally the value as well as the attribute that's being changed. So if this worked, what that means now is it should say username equals whatever, or password equals whatever. So let's go ahead and test that. Let's reload the site, and username equals that, password equals that, and then we can test it again down here. And there we go. Okay, great. So the inputs are being properly connected and registered with the callback functions, which we can use to update the actual visitor itself. So every time the user types a character into these fields, we want to actually update this visitor's value. So let's go ahead and do that. So for those of you who are new to React, what you want to do is whenever you're updating an object in the state, you don't literally want to update it. You want to create a copy and then mutate the copy and then reset the state. That's the way you want to handle that. So we can do let updated visitor. And we want to create a copy this state visitor, and technically this can be a constant. And since we have the attribute being passed into the function, we can just assign the attribute like that, and then assign it to the value like that. And then we reset the state. Like so. So every time you want to change a value in the state, you don't literally change the state's reference. You create a copy, and then you change the copy, and then you reset the state. In a React project, that's how it works. So there's no visual confirmation here. So what I'm going to do next is create two more functions. So we're going to create one for register and another one for login. And in each one of these, we're just going to do a console log representing the current value of the visitor. So register. This state visitor. And then log in, and that's it. So as you might imagine, these buttons will be connected to their respective functions over here, register and login. So that's going to be the onClick handler. So this register find. And down here, now these buttons will trigger these functions, which will then console log the current state values, assuming that this is these were properly connected. So let's go ahead and test it out. So, okay. Oh, all right. So here's what I forgot. So I don't know if you saw it, but real quickly, the values did flash. But because that these inputs are inside of a form, by default, this button is submitting that form. So we're immediately being redirected to the form's destination, which is question mark by default. So what we want to do here instead is that take the event input that's implicitly passed into these calls, and we're going to do what's called prevent default, which will do kind of what it sounds like. It'll prevent the default action from taking place, and so that it will not actually submit the form. It will just stay put. And so now when we try it again, we should C. So I'm going to do username ABC and password 123. Now it'll just stay put. Okay, hopefully that's easier to see. DEF, and then 456. There we go. Great. So our registration and login inputs are being properly handled over here in the state inside this component. So good. So far, hopefully everyone's with me. So what we need to do next is we need to now send this data to a backend, right? If you think about what happens next is, I mean, normally what I would do is some basic validation, like make sure that the username contains at least 6 characters, that kind of thing. But we're going to keep it simple for this project. But rest assured, normally what I would do is some simple validation, especially if there's an email involved. If there's using passwords, there would be like maybe 2 passwords fields, make sure they match, etc. But again, we're going to keep it simple for the sake of this demonstration. What we want to do next is take this data and send it to a backend, which will then register the new user with a database. Right, that's going to be the next thing. So right now, our backend doesn't support that. So we need to now create a backend for this data to receive. However, before we do that, let's discuss the mechanisms through which that data will actually be sent to the backend. Now that will be done through what's called an action. This will dispatch an action to the backend, which will then the action will then send the data to the backend, and then it will receive the callback from the API, and then it will process the callback and then consume the data, basically reset the data. That's essentially the one-way data flow. So at this juncture, the next logical step is to create the action which will send the data to the backend. So we're not quite ready for the backend yet, but I just want you to understand where we are in the process. So we're going to create an action which will send the data to the backend, and then the action will also receive that data and then decide what to do with it. Receive the response from the backend, and then decide what to do with it. So that's where we are right now. So what we need to do is create that action. So if you look at the SRC, you'll see that we already have an actions directory. So like I said, Turbo scaffolds a lot of the Redux out of the box for you. It might do a little bit too much, honestly. A lot of this template code I never end up using anyway. But here are a series of actions that are pretty typical. So we're not going to use any of these. Let's get rid of all of these. But I am going to leave the register one behind, like that, and then let's create our own implementation. Let's see here. So what's happening here is that the Turbo client is creating a user, but we're not going to use a Turbo client. We're going to use our own database. So we're going to do this from the bottom up. We're going to create our own API requests and our own API handlers and whatnot. So I'm just leaving this behind for reference, so we don't lose track of how this action is set up. So next thing we want to do is create the, let's see here, utils. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to create an HTTP handler to send HTTP requests. Okay, there's some code in here that we can reuse, so we're not going to do this from the bottom up, but we're going to create an HTTP request manager to send basic gets, posts, and puts to really any API, but obviously it's going to be our API. So let's go ahead and get that started. We're going to place that in the utils directory, and let's call it HTTP.js. So let's go ahead and head over to the src and then the utils directory, and then let's create an http.js module, which is going to be basically a wrapper class around the HTTP library that comes installed by default. So inside the index, don't forget to export the HTTP library. We're not going to use the Turbo client, so we can just get rid of that. And inside the HTTP library, we're going to use the superagent library to make our API requests. And then we're going to set up an export default. And here we're going to set up a post request. And let's use the implementation in the Turbo client to make this a little. Excuse me. To make this a little bit easier. Excuse me, just got something stuck in my throat. Let's see here. We have our endpoint and our body. And we're going to return a new promise. We want to do resolve and then reject here. Okay, and then here we want to send the superagent post request. That's going to be endpoint and body. Set accept person. This takes an error and a response callback, and if there is an error, we will reject and then reject error. And if there is a success, then we will resolve with the response. And then, if I recall, the response is typically packaged inside the body key within the superagent APIs. All right, so that should work. I'm going to set up another one for get right now because that's almost definitely we're going to need that. So let's set up a get. And then, let's see. Did make one small mistake here. The endpoint, the body does not go in there. It goes inside a send function like that. And then inside here, for the get, we have a query like that. And then that should be params. Because in a get request, you don't send a body, you send query parameters. So this is a more appropriate way to send a get. And everything else looks good. So this should be a good wrapper around the superagent library. I went a little bit fast on that, so if you guys need another moment or two to make sure you're caught up, go ahead and just make sure it looks like that. Okay, so let's see here. Next thing we want to do is we're going to now head over to our backend and create an auth route so that we can send requests to our backend. Let's go ahead and do that. So over here, we want to create an auth route inside the routes directory. Now the backend here is just a regular Node Express backend. So there's nothing special going on here. So we want to create an auth.js route. And if we open that up, obviously it's empty. So I'm going to copy and paste from the API code into here. And for now, I'm going to set up a test. And this will say data. Okay. So for now, this will be it. Obviously, we're just testing, so there's not much going on here. So we're just going to bounce back a request using a get endpoint. So we're using a get call right now instead of a post. So we want to be mindful of that. And then we have to connect this route inside the app file of the Node Express project. So now we're in the back end now, right? So if we head over to the app.js, you'll see that our routes are imported right here. So we're going to have to connect one more route, which is the auth route. Right? So here we're importing it, right? And then now we need to set the path, which will invoke that route. So that's going to be auth. Right here, we're specifying that the auth path will route to this handler. So we're going to be testing the following path. It's going to be localhost 3000/auth/test. And we should see this JSON. So let's go ahead and confirm that because that's pretty easy to do. So let's go ahead and run the dev server. Okay, and then here it's auth and then test. And here we go. Okay, so that was successful on the browser, so that's good. So that means this route has now been connected successfully. So now we want to call it from our React components. So here we have an HTTP module, which basically is just a wrapper around the super agent library. And don't forget, we're using promises to call these functions. So let's call the get, and let's confirm that we're getting the same data back, just like this, when we call the same endpoint using this wrapper library. So inside the auth component, we now want to import HTTP from the utils directory. So that is components, that's 2 levels up. So here's the auth, we have 1, 2 levels up. So 1, 2, and then utils. And then make sure that your Webpack isn't complaining. So far, so good. And now we want to call the this get function that we wrote to the auth endpoint that we just tested in order to make sure that it's also working from the React client side. So I'm going to do that on the register button. So HTTP get, and that takes an endpoint and a params argument. So that's going to be the endpoint, which is auth test. The params can be null, so we can just leave that empty. This is a promise, so we just want to run a standard promise sequence. Okay, and that should give us a response either way. Then here we're just going to throw a simple error message. Obviously, if something goes wrong, we want to see some sort of error text to that effect. Okay, so the Webpack just rebuilt, so that's good. And now we can go back to the home page and test the register and get rid of this and see what happens. So here we go. So here is the get command. Hopefully you can see that. That says this is the test endpoint. So that's the same as the other one. That's That's this one right here. So we are now seeing the same response from the auth endpoint that we set up purely for testing purposes. So that's great. That means it worked. Hopefully everyone saw that. I kind of went fast on that. So hopefully everyone caught that and made it work on their end as well. So now what we want to do is test the corresponding post request, because when you register a user or log a user in or whatever, you want to do that through post. That's really the best way to handle that. So let's go ahead to back to our backend, our auth route, and let's create another one for post. Except this time, let's give it a proper name. Let's give it a register, and then confirmation success, and then data. Let's just bounce back the original data. That's going to be rec.body. That way, we can just basically boomerang the data right back just to make sure everything is being properly sequenced through the HTTP calls. So now here, instead of get, we want to do post, and then we want to do auth register. This time we do need the body params populated, so that's going to be the visitor just as is. And then let's say response. Okay, great. So now we're calling the auth/register endpoint via the post HTTP method, which will then call this right here and just bounce the data right back to us inside the console log, which should say response and then the data. Hopefully all that will work. So let's just confirm that. Whatever, 1, 2, 3. And let's see what we get. And here it is. So you can see here from the actual API backend that the data being returned to us is exactly the data we typed into the input fields. So it worked fine. Just for good measure, let's set up the login endpoint as well. Which will do the same thing. So let's go ahead and just run that through. So that will be login. So now we have a dedicated auth endpoint for register and for login. And we have confirmed that the data is being successfully sent from the front end to the back end and then bouncing it right back to the front end just to make sure everything is accurate and the data flow is properly being managed. So here I'm going to test the login real quick. And there we go. So hopefully you guys got that working on your end as well. Again, I went a little bit fast, so you know, if you're not getting it to work on your end, just give me a shout on the chat room, and we'll see if we can get that taken care of. So I'm going to comment out this stuff now. This is no longer necessary. We can get rid of that. And okay, good. So what we want to do next is take care of this from a back-end perspective. So if you think about what's supposed to happen next, let's take care of the register first. What's supposed to happen next is this is supposed to create a new user with the parameters entered into the input fields, the username and the password, right? So right here is where we should create a new user and enter it into the database. But right now, none of that's hooked up, none of that's connected, right? So what we want to do now is connect that part of the ecosystem. So we're going to create a user model for this project inside of a models directory. So let's go ahead and head over to our root directory, and let's create a new one called models. And then inside that directory, we want to create a, let's call it profile. And inside that profile.js is where we're going to define the profile schema for this particular project. Now, this is going to be a very simple one because, again, this is just a demonstration level project. But we're going to create a very, very primitive profile schema, which will have a username and a password. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it, just the username and password. So let's go and get that going. So let's do const mongoose we're using the Mongoose ORM, and this will be a Mongo database. So let's do let's see, Mongoose. Okay, great. So inside here is where we set up all the attributes for the schema, where we literally define the schema. Let's go ahead and do that. So here we're going to have the username. And these are objects which define the type. This is going to be a string. And the default value, which is going to be empty string. And we should pass in a trim boolean so that the values are trimmed in case the user enters a trailing space by mistake, something like that. And then a password. So type again string. We do not want to trim this because the user might be entering a space on purpose, which would be kind of strange, but it's password. So, and I always enter a timestamp for all of my objects because I like to know literally when they were created, and this is going to be default to now. So this is kind of like a birth date, like when the object was created. This is it tracks that on creation, and that's going to be it for this. So we have a very, very simple user schema. Obviously, in a more robust project, it would contain a lot more than this. So let's go ahead and use that as our schema for this project. So now what we need to do is establish the database connection. I'm going to import the user schema here. So require okay, great. So now this won't work until we establish a database connection, right? So that's going to happen in the app.js of the backend. So if we head over to the backend, here, the app.js of the backend, you'll see that there's some new, how can I put, commented out text here, which is describing a couple new features of Turbo. The most notable of which is you can now include your own database connection. So this is very important. You see over here on line 4, we want to comment that out. We want to get rid of that, and then instead we want to uncomment all of this. And what you can see is that when we initialize the app over here on line 25, or at least my line 25, we can pass in a config object, which establishes the views directory, the static directory, and the database connection, the database URL. Pretty much for the views and the static directory, you want to leave those as is. I mean, I don't really come across too many situations where you want to write your own, you want to have a different views directory or whatnot, but you do have the option if you want to. Hold on, let me just get this back. That's annoying. But this database URL, let's go ahead and take care of this right now. So we're not going to use the default values here. So comment that out. And instead, we're going to hardcode, we're going to just literally type this in. So it's going to be Mongo DB, local host, and then the name of the database. So we're going to go with user auth demo, like that. And then don't worry about the production URL yet. We'll take care of that towards the end of this sequence. So here we're using a local Mongo instance, which will manage our database. So hopefully everyone can see that. And then, so now we reinitialize the app using these config options again, the most important of which is the local connection to a Mongo DB. So you don't have to use the Turbo data store if you don't want to. That was another major issue raised by a lot of developers who are using Turbo, is that they want to use their own database instance. So I got that working. And when you deploy to the actual production environment, staging environment, excuse me, that'll work as well. And coming down the pipe eventually is a Postgres integration as well. So you don't have to just use Mongo if you don't want to. Alrighty, so what that means though for our project is now we have to run the Mongo server if we want to test our project locally. So in a new tab in your terminal, we want to do MongoD like that and run the local Mongo server. And then we go back here and run the Turbo dev server. Make sure, excuse me, make sure everything still works, which it doesn't, because I probably misspelled something. So auth.js, require models, profile, excuse me, profile. So inside the auth.js, make sure you have it as profile, not user. So I typed user by mistake. So okay. And then here it's saying the database connection didn't successfully happen. So let's go ahead and figure that out. So Mongo is running. Okay, so let's see here. Now I'm going to just hard code the string as the local string every time and see what happens over there. Okay. Error message. Let's see here. DB connection failed. Port must be specified. Wondering if I spelled some of this wrong. Let's see. Yeah, I'm not sure what's going on here. I'm going to have to debug this. However, I was going to wrap it up right around here anyway. So this actually is pretty fortuitous with the timing. So I'm going to take care of this and figure out what's going on. Obviously, I'll fix it for tomorrow's session. But tomorrow, once we get the database connection going, we're going to start persisting users to the backend, or profiles, excuse me. And then when a user registers, this will be entered into the backend and then bounced back to the client side so that the React application can then take over and insert that profile into the Redux architecture. So this one issue notwithstanding, apologize for this. I'll figure it out though between now and tomorrow. Hopefully everything you got working on your end. Let's get rid of this commented out code as well. We don't need this anymore. Yeah, this is a strange bug. I'm not really sure what's going on. But anyway, we'll figure it out tomorrow. And yeah, so tomorrow, same time, 9 p.m. This should take around 3 sessions based on the pacing. So this will be Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And hold on, let me see what Casey's saying. Oh, thanks, Casey. You too. And yeah, that's it. So every time I do these, it'll be the same time, 9 p.m., so that hopefully people on the West Coast can also follow along. So that's it. Okay, so thanks for watching, and tomorrow at 9 p.m. we will pick up where we left off. So see you then. Caesar, yeah, this will be posted on my channel, but only after I'm done with all 3 parts. So not right away. This will be done. Well, this will be on my YouTube channel right away, but it won't be posted on my website as a tutorial until I get through all the parts. So, all right, thanks for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow, same time, 9 p.m.